Ever since the introduction of the Game Boy in 1989, the portable console market has exploded in popularity, and Nintendo has reigned as the undisputed champion. While the Game Boy wasn't the first handheld console, nor was it the first one to use interchangeable cartridges, it was the first one to become such a cultural phenomenon. Some other companies would enter the market and try to compete, but none would come close to the immeasurable amount of success that Nintendo had with its domination of the handheld market. At least, that was the case until 2004, when Sony threw their hat into the ring. At E3 2004, Sony gave us the first look at their portable console, the PSP, short for PlayStation Portable, and it would release later that same year in Japan and a few months later in North America and Europe. It was quite a technologically impressive device for its time. For one thing, it had hardware capabilities that rivaled that of the PS2, but it also had multimedia features like the ability to look at pictures, browse the internet, listen to music, and watch movies, and there were hundreds of movies available that looked and played amazingly for a handheld device. It was definitely a little better than what Nintendo tried to do. While it was marketed primarily as a gaming device and meant to compete with the DS, because of its multimedia features, it was also meant to compete with things like the iPod. It didn't sell nearly as well as the DS or the iPod, but it still sold better than most of its other competitors, like the Zune. And keep in mind, it launched before the iPhone and iPod Touch, so if you wanted a device that could play games, watch movies, play music, and browse the internet, this was one of, if not your best option. It wasn't quite as successful as Sony had hoped, but 81 million in sales is nothing to be ashamed of. In fact, that's even more than the 3DS and just barely less than the Game Boy Advance. Either way, it was enough to warrant a successor, and in 2011, Sony would throw their hat into the ring again and release the PS Vita.
Temple of Serpents.
The Vita boasted extremely powerful hardware for a handheld at the time. It also had a lot of really cool features like a camera, 3G internet, not one but two touchpads, two analog sticks, and in the future, it would have remote play with the PS4. It also had a pretty promising lineup of games, but unfortunately, the initial sales were less than impressive and support for it died pretty quickly. At the end of its lifespan, it had abysmal sales compared to the 3DS, and just barely sold more than the Wii U. Now, there's been a lot of debate as to why the Vita failed. The most common reason I hear is the overpriced proprietary memory cards, which are absolutely ridiculous and I'm sure didn't help, but I don't think that was the sole thing that killed it. A lot of people say it was because of the expensive introductory price, which, again, I can see, but the 3DS had the exact same introductory price. Some people say it was due to a disappointing lineup of games and launch sales, but again, the 3DS also had that same problem. A lot of people seem to forget that the 3DS didn't have a very good start either, but unlike Sony, they were able to correct their mistakes, get the 3DS back on its feet, and turn it into something successful. I think the real reason is that after the disappointing launch, they just kinda gave up and decided to focus all their effort into marketing the PS4. It's a shame because, like I said, the Vita was one of the most technologically impressive handheld devices of its time, and personally, as a system, I think the Vita is magnitudes better than the 3DS. Had Sony actually learned from their mistakes and actually put effort into selling the Vita, I think that generation would have played out very differently. I don't think it would have killed the 3DS, but it would have been a lot less one-sided. Not to mention, in retrospect, I don't think Sony needed to go as all out as they did in marketing the PS4. Most of that work was done by Microsoft.
Fortunately, we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
Right. So stick with 360, that's your message if you don't.
Now, despite the Vita's quote-unquote failure, it was actually pretty popular in Japan, and in the West, it had a small but devoted player base that made publishers want to localize games for it. I mean, If all you really cared about were JRPGs, rhythm games, puzzle games, visual novels, and the occasional action game, the Vita was a great alternative to the PS4 that you could carry in your pocket. Even some of the best-known gaming franchises today got started on the Vita. Not to mention, it was also a great console for indie games, and was getting them until as recently as last year. That being said, most of the niche and purpose that the Vita provided has since been taken over by the Switch and the Steam Deck, and for that reason, what few exclusives it did have been ported to PC, Switch, and or PS4. But there are still a handful of games that are stranded on the console. I made this video because I wanted to shed light on some of the games that are only playable on this system. Now, the PS Vita digital store is still up and running, but it could shut down any day now. In fact, Sony already tried to do this last year, but undid that decision after fan backlash. However, there's nothing preventing them from changing their minds later, especially given that they haven't been the most consumer-friendly in recent times. And unlike the 3DS and Wii U, where emulation is high in demand, that's not so much the case for the Vita for reasons I stated earlier. In fact, to call Vita emulation rudimentary would be an understatement. Out of all the games I tried to emulate, in only 2 of them was I able to get past the initial load screen. All the others would either just load infinitely or crash the program, and one of the ones I was able to get to run had serious audio issues. When the Vita digital store dies, most of these games will die with it, and the ones that are available physically will become even more rare and expensive than they already are. In this video, I'm going to be covering as many exclusive games for the PS Vita as possible, and before I get started, I want to make 3 things clear. First of all, I'm only going to be looking at games that are still exclusive for the PS Vita. By that, I mean games that are available and only available for this particular console. Any games that have been ported to or from any other platforms, including PC, do not count. Second of all, here I mostly want to stick to lesser known games for the system, even for its own standards, so I won't be looking at most first-party games or pretty much any Western-made games, even if they technically count as exclusives. Lastly, I'm only going to be looking at games that are officially available in English, because I am not Japanese and I do not speak Japanese. There are a lot more Vita exclusives that have only been released in Japan, and if I were to cover them all, I'd be here for ages. Other than that, if there are any games I happen to miss, be sure to let me know what they are. Maybe I'll make another video like this later to cover some of the games I missed, but for now, these are some PS Vita games that have not been ported to other platforms. I figured it's only appropriate that we start with a lesser-known game from a somewhat well-known developer for the Vita, with Mayq Labyrinth of Death, developed by Compile Heart and published by Idea Factory, released for the Vita in Japan in 2015 and 2016 for North America and Europe. Compile Heart is probably best known for being the developers of the Hyperdimension Neptunia series, and despite having only existed since 2006, they have a lot of games under their belt, most of which are very heavily anime-themed, and a lot of them are also made for the Vita. Though, what I find really weird about Mayq is that, unlike a lot of these other games, I can kinda at least think of a reason as to why they haven't gotten ports. However, it seems that nearly all of Compile Heart's games released for the Vita, no matter how obscure, have been ported to PC, except this one, and I can't figure out why. There is a blank Metacritic page for a PC version, so maybe there was one planned at some point, but it never went through. Well, the point is that Mayq is only available for the PS Vita, so let's take a look. Mayq is a first-person dungeon crawler with a grid-like structure and turn-based combat. It's nothing we haven't seen before. Though, what makes this game interesting is your ability to fight with both your human party members and your autonomous mechs called Guardians. These sort of act as your, well, Guardians, and in battle, they're going to be doing most of the fighting for you. You can customize them with different parts like their cores, bodies, and left and right arms, and each one gives your Guardian a set of abilities, and there are a lot to choose from. And once you get multiple party members, some skills can actually combo into others, although this is completely random, so I don't recommend relying on it in battle. What I do recommend doing, though, is keeping in mind the types of your Guardians, skills, and enemies. They all have one of 5 elemental types, each with their own weaknesses and resistances. Think of it like the type chart in Pokemon, but simplified. You and your guardians also have separate life bars. Once your guardian goes down, you'll be open to the enemy's attacks, and they do a lot more damage to you than they do to your guardians. And once all your characters go down, it's game over, and your characters have their own skills that they learn by leveling up. If you want, you can choose to have your characters use their skills instead, but unlike your guardians where you can use their skills as many times as you want, you're limited on how much of your character skills can be used. It's a pretty simple battle system all things considered, but I did have a lot of fun with it. It definitely has a lot of customization to experiment with like most Compile Heart games do, and the dungeon crawling is fast-paced and fun, with a reasonable encounter rate and designs that aren't overly confusing. For the story, you take on the role of Estra, one of 5 Makaishi, which are, and I quote, demon machine soldier girls, who, along with 4 other Makaishi, are tasked with conquering 4 different towers so that they can awaken the guardian gods who can set the stars back in motion because they've stopped rotating. It's really nothing all that special, the plot is pretty simple and straightforward, and the characters are all bland and painfully cliche, and the lore is also not that interesting, but it at least knows this. The cutscenes are pretty short, and I actually did enjoy some of the characters' interactions while dungeon crawling. Presentation-wise, I mean, the graphics are fine and everything, the music is okay, and while I like the concept of the characters' designs, I really wish this artist would actually take the time to learn what the human body looks like. And also, to my surprise, this game actually has English voice acting, and it's not the worst English voice acting I've ever heard, but not the best either. And for some reason, the English voice actors aren't credited. For such an obscure game supposedly left to die on this unsuccessful system, MakeU isn't bad. It's actually pretty good. I wouldn't say it's worth hunting down a Vita or PSTV specifically for, but if you already own one, you can easily get this game digitally for just $10. If you're a fan of Compile Heart and or first-person dungeon crawlers, MakeU is a pretty good RPG that I definitely recommend for existing Vita owners. And for non-Vita owners, I can only hope that Compile Heart remembers that this game exists and gives it the port that it deserves. While we're on the topic of Compile Heart, let's look at a game from a somewhat popular franchise, Hyperdimension Neptunia, producing Perfection. Also commonly known as Hyperdimension Neptunia PP if the reviews are anything to go by. Published by Idea Factory in 2013, and 2014 everywhere else by Nippon Ichi Software. Now, if you're at all familiar with Compile Heart, I'm sure you're familiar with the Neptunia series, but in case you're not, it's a fairly recent, but also popular and very big series of JRPGs, though I don't even know if I'd call it a JRPG series anymore. I'd say it's more of a gaming franchise that started out as a series of JRPGs. It's best described as a parody of the console war. It's set in a place called Gamindustry, divided into different locations governed by goddesses who represent consoles, and are in a never-ending war for dominance. It's also one of the first things that started the whole meme of taking inanimate objects and turning them into sexualized anime girls. Ever since its introduction, it has had dozens of spin-off products like strategy games, action games, side-scrollers, card games, bullet hells, and in this case, an idol management simulator. The original Neptunia games all started on PS3 before they were remade for the Vita, and the Vita would become the home of pretty much every game until they were ported to PC and started being developed for other systems like the PS4 and 5. I've played my fair share of all 3 Rebirth games, and for what they are, they're actually pretty good RPGs and a lot of fun, but I haven't played any of the spin-offs. In fact, had this one not still be an exclusive to the PS Vita, I don't think I'd have batted an eye at it. And again, much like MakeU, every single Neptunia game released for the Vita has been ported to PC, except for this one. And what's even weirder, this one was actually the first game in the series released for the Vita, even before Rebirth 1. Oh, and if you're wondering why I'm recording myself playing it, that's because for whatever reason this game isn't playable on the PlayStation TV. But anyway, like I mentioned earlier, Producing Perfection is an idol management simulation game, where all the sectors of game industry are losing shares because everyone is now hyper-focused on idols, specifically a group called MOB48, an obvious parody of AKB48. Rather than fight them, the goddesses decide that if you can't beat them, become them, and they all summon a random gamer from the real world, that being the player, and from here, you choose one of them to produce for to become the best idol in Gamindustry, and have a song at the top of the charts. The gameplay, if you even want to call it that, is you managing your idol's career. Your idol basically has stats that affect her performance, and you can do various things to increase these stats, like practicing, studying, recording, doing marketing campaigns, and concerts to increase your number of fans. You can also get to know the other CPUs, that's what the goddesses are called, and even start becoming affectionate with them. There are a lot of variables you have to think about. For one thing, you have to make sure to keep increasing your CPU stats with each activity that you can only do one of every day, and oftentimes, events will happen that are out of your control, and these can either have positive or negative effects, and on top of this, you also have to make sure to achieve your goal within 180 days, and you can't let your idol get too stressed, otherwise you die. And by that I mean you just fail the game, so be sure to give her a break when her stress level gets too high. This game was not received very favorably when it released back in 2014, and even fans don't speak too fondly of it, which might be the reason as to why it hasn't been ported. If you've ever played any management simulation games, you can probably get an idea of what this game is going to be like. I have played a handful of similar management games myself, mostly for mobile phones, and for all the criticism it got, for what it is, producing perfection really isn't bad. It's definitely engaging, and the more I played, the more I found myself genuinely caring for my idol and wanting her to succeed. But the problem is that this wasn't a $5 iPod Touch game released in 2009. This was a retail game exclusive for a next-gen handheld in 2013 that launched at $30. Probably the biggest kick to the nads is that during concerts, you don't actually push the buttons to keep the song going like in most rhythm games. You just move the camera and activate stage effects to keep the audience engaged. You can also play dress up beforehand, but regardless of how you go about it, you can pretty effortlessly achieve a high score. I'm not going to say it's impossible to get enjoyment out of this, but I would have much rather been able to have some sort of actual rhythm game here instead. The graphics aren't really impressive, but it still has a lot of the charm that defines the series, and the songs for the idol concerts are pretty good. Oh, and get this, the English voice acting is actually good. I mean, that's true for most of the series, but out of all the weird Japanese games from the mid-2010s with good English voice acting, you wouldn't think Neptunia would be one of them. Producing perfection is commonly considered the black sheep of the Neptunia series, and while it's in no way a bad game, it's just not up to par with what most people expected from this series, and what people were expecting from a retail game for this console. $30 for this game is highway robbery, and to make matters worse, a physical copy today you'll be lucky to get for double that. Thankfully, the price has since dropped to just $10 digitally, and for that, I'd say it's not a terrible deal if you already own a Vita and are a Neptunia fan. I also do think that this game deserves a PC port just so that it's no longer the only game in this series trapped on the Vita, but that decision is up to Compile Heart and Idea Factory, and if they haven't ported it already, I don't think the chances of them doing it later are too favorable. Well, while the Vita handheld is still out, let's move on to the only other game on here that can't be played on the PSTV, and also the oldest game on here, Army Corps of Hell, developed by Intersphere and published by Square Enix in 2011 in Japan and 2012 in North America as a launch title for the system. Now this is more like it. Right off the bat, this game lets you know exactly what you're getting into. It's an action RPG where you take on the role of this Demon King who assumes command of an army of goblins and is determined to become the ruler of Hell. From here, you go around with your little army of goblins and take on everything in your path. The story is overall pretty simple, but the cutscenes are magnificent. The characters all talk in this unintelligible language, and the voices are great, and so is the artwork. Just from looking at the gameplay, you're probably expecting something similar to Overlord, but it's actually more similar to Pikmin with the way you throw your minions at enemies, where they'll latch onto them, and once enough are on, you can launch a salvo attack, which will finish them off in most cases. At least that's the case for the soldiers. Your minions can come in two other classes: Spearmen, who can't latch but deal slightly more damage when attacking and travel further, and Magi, who can launch projectile attacks. The gameplay is pretty simple and kind of repetitive, but the more you play, the more gimmicks the game will start throwing at you that you have to keep adapting to, and it prevents the gameplay from ever becoming boring. Different enemies and bosses have unique strengths and weaknesses, and it's up to you to figure out which type of goblin you need to take them out. At the start of each level, you'll need to figure out how many of each one to take into each level. When you get attacked, your goblins will lie dead on the ground, but can be revived by simply walking close to them. It sounds easy, but with so many allies to manage and so much going on screen during battle, it's easy to lose track of them. Thankfully, this game is pretty generous with spots that let you recruit more allies, and overall this game is pretty easy. The levels are divided into a series of islands where battles take place, and once you've defeated all the required enemies, a bridge will open up that lets you move on to the next one, and you keep doing this until the level is over. Outside of battle, you can also craft new weapons, armor pieces, and items using materials you pick up after battle, and you can even customize your commander with items that have different effects. Presentation-wise, Army Corps of Hell looks great for a Vita launch title, with it rarely ever lagging, and the heavy metal soundtrack is amazing. This game got pretty middling reviews when it came out, but I honestly had a lot of fun with this game. I wouldn't say it's as good as similar games like Overlord and Pikmin, but for a game you can play on the go, I'd say Army Corps of Hell is an easy game to recommend, especially when a digital copy will only set you back by $10, and you can even get a physical copy for under $20. If you own a PS Vita, definitely check this game out. There is a lot to love about Army Corps of Hell. Now, out of all the genres that most people bought the Vita to play, would you believe that one of the Vita's few remaining exclusive games would be a sports game? Yeah, this is Let's Fish Hooked On, developed by Sims and published by Wired Productions in 2013. This has got to be one of the weirdest releases I have ever seen. It advertises itself as this arcade fishing game with a very cartoony anime art style, and here it just doesn't look right. It looks like someone took Cabela's Dangerous Hunts and just modded anime characters into it. And the art doesn't even look good. It looks like something you'd see in one of those mid-2000s dating flash games. And that's even more true for the menu. And the in-game character models just look disturbing. In fact, this game overall is just lacking in polish, even for a budget title. The textures are very low res, the frame rate chugs constantly, fish are randomly phasing in and out of existence, and there are a ton of translation errors in the menus. Not to mention, the system menus where you save your game, you select your options by pressing the circle button, not the X button. Yeah. Now, the gameplay is pretty much what you would expect from a fishing game. You choose your bait, throw out your line, wait for fish to bite, and when they do, you get this mini game where you have to fight against the fish by either pushing the D-pad or sliding the hook in the right direction on the touchscreen. It sounds repetitive, and it is, but there's a little more to it than that. For one thing, you can play as one of 4 characters, who each have a special ability. Jamie, who is good at hooking, Ryuji, who is good at casting, Kano, who's good at fighting, and Ai, who's good at catching. There's also quite a lot of different fish to catch and bait to use, and each one has a different depth that it goes in once it's in the water. Plus, the weather affects the fish's behavior too. It's up to you to figure out the behaviors of all the different fish and how to catch them given the circumstances. Plus, during the story mode, and yes, this game does have a story mode, or as the game calls it, World Tour mode, you can actually get points to unlock special skills for your characters. Even with all this, Let's Fish Hooked On is a game that I just could not get into. I found the fishing aspect tedious, and the story didn't really do me a lot of favors. It's basically just you playing as one of the game's 4 characters, all entering the fishing tournament for different reasons, and each one is trying to win. It also doesn't help that there's no voice acting during these parts, and you can't even scroll through the dialogue at your own pace during the cutscenes. Now, I don't have anything against fishing games, I just suck at them. The only fishing game I've ever really been able to get into, if you even count it, was Big's fishing stages in Sonic Adventure. And saying that I got into that is being extremely generous. If you are a fan of fishing games, and you're just dying to have one to play on your Vita, well, then maybe Let's Fish Hooked On is the game for you. It's only $10, so for that price I'd say knock yourself out, but otherwise, don't waste your time. I can assure you that this is a game you will not be able to get hooked on. Now, going back to the trend of taking inanimate objects and turning them into anime girls, if you've ever wanted something that did that with automobiles, well, I have just the game for you. Drive Girls, developed by Tamsoft and published by Axis Games exclusively for the PS Vita in 2017. Now, as you would expect, Drive Girls is a game that places a lot of emphasis on racing, but that's actually only half of what it is. The other half is an action hack and slash, much along the lines of Tamsoft's other games, like Senran Kagura and Hyperdimension Neptunia U. This game is set in a city called Sun Island, full of people who can transform into cars, and you take on the role of a car girl named Lancier who joins some kind of police force that's tasked with fighting giant robot arthropods creatively named bugs, and yeah, that's about all there is to it. Sound interesting? Well, guess what? It's not. Not that I had high expectations from a game called Drive Girls, but I couldn't have cared less about this story if I tried. The main issue with it is that the game just kind of shoves you into its world without giving you a reason to be invested. Like, who am I playing as? Who is Lancier and why does she want to join this police force? Who are these other girls? What are bugs? Where are they coming from? Why are they attacking us? Why do humans have the ability to transform into cars here? Most of these questions go completely unanswered, and the ones that are answered in the most boring and predictable ways possible, and the cutscenes do little to add to the story. They seem to be more interested in teaching you about the power of friendship and showing you fan service whenever they can. There's even a mechanic where when your health gets down to like a quarter, your armor will get knocked off, but this game is so easy this will rarely happen. Does the gameplay make up for this? Kinda. It's definitely a unique idea combining racing with action hack and slash, but the transition isn't all that seamless. Battles take place on these highway-like environments, and you can switch between vehicle form and anime girl form anytime you want. Vehicle form is more focused on speed and is used for traveling long distances, while your human form is more designed for combat. Although, you can actually still fight in your vehicle form and stay that way the entire game if you want, but I don't recommend doing this because you're not as powerful when in vehicle form. Most of the levels have you either fighting a horde of enemies or racing against another opponent, but there are some levels that encourage you to alternate between forms, usually for traveling long distances before switching to your human form and fighting more enemies. Combat works like any other hack and slash. You have weak attacks, heavy attacks, and you can alternate between the two for different combos. And here, you're encouraged to stack combos as much as you can and keep the battle flowing, because doing so provides bonuses to your attack and defense up to twice as much. And when this happens, you can fully deplete these meters to unleash a very powerful special attack. The combat is pretty average and also kind of monotonous, but it is still fun when played in short bursts, and the levels can last anywhere from 15 minutes to 45 seconds. I just don't recommend marathoning it because if you do, it won't be long before you start to get bored of it. There's also a surprising amount of customization. You can play as up to 5 different characters, and in the game's menu, you can give them stickers that increase their stats, and you can also buy upgrades at the shop, as well as restoratives that you can equip and bring into missions. But regardless of who you're playing as or what upgrades you're using, it still boils down to the same average hack and slash and or racing gameplay through the same bland environments with little differences other than the backdrops over and over again. Drive Girls didn't receive a lot of attention when it came out back in 2017, and the few outlets that did cover it didn't like it that much. It currently has a 39 on Metacritic, and while I think that is a little harsh, I do think a lot of the criticisms are valid. Drive Girls isn't a bad game, but it's repetitive, and you can tell they were under a strict budget when working on it. I think the concept is interesting, and had it had a slightly higher budget and had a little more polish, I think Drive Girls could have been a really fun game, but unfortunately what we got was an interesting concept stuck in a painfully average game. And considering that the price of this game hasn't gone down a single penny from its launch price of $30, I just cannot recommend it. Okay, so literally as I was finishing this video up, I tried to re-download this game to get some more footage, and I could not find this game on the Vita's digital storefront. I had a friend double check for me, and yes, I can confirm that just barely a month after buying it specifically for this video, this game has been delisted. So yeah, thankfully it did get a physical release, and thankfully it's not much more, but I imagine that once more people catch on to that, the price will go up. So if you are interested in this game, I recommend grabbing it while it's hot. Now, I figured with all the games I've covered so far, I'd have to at least cover one of these several visual novels that are still exclusive to the Vita. This is Bad Apple Wars, developed by Automate and published by Idea Factory in 2015 in Japan, and by Axis Games in 2017 in North America and Europe. Now, if the developer's name wasn't enough of a hint, Bad Apple Wars is an otome game, meaning it is intended for female audiences. Here, you take on the role of a Japanese high schooler named Rinka who dies in a car accident on the way to school one morning, and then wakes up trapped in some weird school campus named Neva Academy, where people who lived unfulfilling lives go when they die. Supposedly, if you're a good student and make it to graduation, you'll be able to move on with your life. Now, doesn't this idea sound kind of familiar? Yeah, this is basically Angel Beats. Yeah, that's a classic, one of the best animes of the early 2010s. The fact that I'm calling that a classic makes me feel really old, but getting back to the game, not everyone wants to participate and graduate, so within the school grounds are two rivaling factions. You have the good apples, who are the good students, and the perfects, who are the school's rule enforcers, and then the bad apples, the rebellious delinquents. You get a choice, but it's not like most visual novels where the choices you make throughout the game affect which side you end with. You actually get to choose a side very early on, but it doesn't have as big of an effect as you may think. As for the gameplay, if you even call it that, there's really not a lot to say. I mean, it's a visual novel. You pretty much just read the text and press X, with occasional choices. You also have this touchscreen minigame where you can touch some of the guys, and this will give you glimpses of their past and what led to them being sent to this place. And of course you can romance one of them at the end. Like most visual novels, it's meant to be replayed, with you making different choices and getting a different outcome each time. Now, my issue with this game, and most visual novels really, is that if a game is going to keep my attention without any gameplay, the story has to be extremely interesting, and I can probably count on my two hands the amount of visual novels that have actually succeeded in doing that. That's not to say Bad Apple Wars isn't interesting though, the plot did keep me invested, the characters are interesting, and the art style is really cool, and the music's not bad either. But it is going to be a while before the plot picks up. I wish I could say more, but doing so would be spoilers. I haven't played any of Otomate's other visual novels for PS Vita, so I can't compare this to any of them, but I can say that Bad Apple Wars is a decent visual novel that I think fans of Otome games that are also Vita owners should at least check out. Now, with all the games we've covered, maybe you're getting a little tired of all the RPGs with the whole goofy, cartoony aesthetics and want something a little more serious. Well, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is, there is a game that is just that, Valhalla Knights 3. The bad news is, it's a massive pile of crap. Valhalla Knights is one of those series that never really found its place among other JRPGs in the late 2000s. None of the games in the series sold or reviewed particularly well, but that didn't stop the series from getting more and more entries. I rarely ever hear anyone talk about these games. I mean, it didn't even develop a cult following like many other JRPGs at the time did, but if Valhalla Knights 3 is anything to go by, it's easy to see why. Valhalla Knights 3 is one of the blandest, most boring games I have ever had the misfortune of playing. But before I get into why, I might as well get the positives out of the way. The opening is great, and that's about it. You start by getting this cinematic that explains the game's lore, then choosing a class and making your character with a creator that is kinda limited in options, and then you're thrown right into the game's world that is, graphically, pretty impressive. For the original PSP, it also doesn't help that this game gives Sonic 06 a run for its money with its abundance of load screens. You go outside, load screen. Go into a new section of the world, load screen. Go into a shop, load screen. Talk to an NPC to initiate a quest, load screen. Cutscene starts, load screen. Cutscene ends, load screen. And these load times aren't very fast either. Apparently, the story is that you're a prisoner who is being let into a new section of the prison that has its own economy, with there being shops, hotels, and other services, and you can even accept quests that require you to leave and come back. You take on the role of a spy who is sent there to investigate and retrieve Flockhart's treasure. I say apparently because the dialogue is so poorly written and there's so much backwards logic that I'm not even really sure what's supposed to be going on. Despite this game's text heaviness, it still somehow fails to give you a reason to care about its story and characters. The main party members are about as bland as can be, and none of the characters, not even the player, have any facial expressions. The closest you get is the characters either nodding or shaking their heads in agreement or disagreement. I tried digging through the options to see if there was any way to make the dialogue go by faster, but there wasn't. There were, however, 5 different options to customize the female character's undergarments. And speaking of, this game is a aggressively horny. Now, you could say that for some of the other games on here, but at least they do it in a goofy, self-aware kind of way, and even then, it's nowhere on the same level as this game. A large part of this game is focused on, for lack of a better politically correct term that YouTube won't demonetize me for, hostesses. You go to these clubs where you talk to women in revealing clothing who you become affectionate with, and once you do, you can play a minigame where you touch them with the Vita's touchscreen. Then, you either get special items or rewards, but only after you've taken them to the hotel for you can probably figure out what. Not only is this game's obsession with hostesses weird, but it also comes at the detriment of the gameplay. For one thing, before you can so much as see what these characters are selling, you have to pay to talk to them. And there's nothing worse than paying to talk to one of them, only to then realize that they don't actually have anything you need. Granted, you don't have to do this, but if you choose not to, you will be missing out on a lot of useful items and party members. And again, this game really pushes this mechanic on you. During the tutorial, the Hostess Club is the only place in the main town you're actually required to visit. The gameplay attempts to bridge the gap between MMOs and single-player RPGs, but instead of bringing together the best aspects of each, it brings together the worst. For one thing, the combat is clunky. It's like the developers couldn't decide if they wanted this to be a turn-based RPG or an action RPG, and what we get is an action RPG combat system that feels incredibly stiff and has little strategy other than just mashing buttons and hoping for the best outcome. You can use special skills and issue commands to your party members during battle, but pulling this menu up during combat isn't exactly ideal, and extremely easy to screw up in the heat of battle. One thing I will say is that this game does have a lot of customization. You can play as a whole bunch of different classes and even choose a subclass and learn skills from it, which is all done through a skill tree system. Oh, and this game also requires a lot of grinding. Yeah, it is very easy to accidentally wander into an area where the enemies are much higher level than you, and there is no way to tell how powerful an enemy is before initiating combat. All you can do is just cross your fingers and hope you're not walking into a death trap. If you do find yourself accepting a quest that requires you to be a higher level, all you can do is just grind with weaker enemies until you feel you're ready. During my whole time playing this game, I wasn't even mad, I was just more baffled at this game for the way it seems to deliberately go out of its way to make the experience as unfun and tedious as possible. If you played any of the other Valhalla Knights games and think they're better, please defend them in the comments, because this game left such a bad taste in my mouth, I don't see myself visiting any of the other games in this series anytime soon. Okay, almost done. And, you know, one of the last things I would expect to be a Vita exclusive would be a Gundam game. This is Mobile Suit Gundam Extreme Versus Force, developed by Elaine Kars and published by Bandai Namco Studios in 2016 for the PS Vita. Now, Mobile Suit Gundam, I believe, needs no introduction. I mean, it's one of the most popular multimedia franchises in existence, with dozens of anime, manga, toys, video games, and it's been going for over 40 years. Obviously, there are a lot of Gundam video games spanning pretty much every genre in existence, and this one is a portable spin-off of the Extreme Versus series, and oddly enough, this is the first one to be officially released in Western territories, and would be the only one for almost 5 years. As soon as you start the game, you're greeted by these AI companions, who send you through a series of reenactments of battles throughout the Gundam franchise. Supposedly, this is done to help save humanity from extinction after observing some of the events of the series. It doesn't really make a lot of sense and feels somewhat forced, but at least it's good fan service, being able to partake in all these different battles as different pilots in their mechs. It's pretty lengthy too, and there are a lot of optional missions to do as well, which you will want to do if you want to unlock more Gundams to play as. The gameplay is best described as something like a third-person action game with MOBA and strategy RPG elements. Obviously, you have your Gundam with all different kinds of weaponry, like your standard gun and sword attacks, but you also have special attacks that you can use to do things like change modes, fire rockets, and one of my favorites, summoning another mech to kamikaze at the enemy. Now, just from watching the gameplay, it may seem like just another mindless action game, but there's actually more strategy to it than you may think. For one thing, the goal of each mission is rarely as simple as defeat all enemies. Usually, it involves something like destroying enemy bases, defending your warship, or getting your warship to a certain location. The most fun missions are the ones where you have to juggle multiple objectives, like having to capture the enemy's objectives and defending yours, because you have to decide between an offensive and defensive strategy. There's definitely a lot of variety, but the combat itself doesn't have a whole lot of depth. It mostly boils down to just flying around, dodging, and attacking until your opponent goes down. But at least the different mechs you can play as do help spice things up, although the controls feel somewhat unresponsive, mainly because your special attacks and blocking require you to push the face buttons in combination with R, and your timing has to be perfect. If you press either of these buttons a nanosecond too early or too late, you'll just find yourself jumping into the air, which is especially frustrating when battling other mechs. Now, depending on the mission, you can bring a certain number of AI-controlled allies into battle that work together as up to 4 teams of 2, and you can command them to different locations from the map screen. There's also a multiplayer mode, but not online, only through ad hoc, which I don't really imagine a lot of people got to play, given that this game came out in 2016, close to the end of the Vita's life, and this game was only released digitally in English. For a game on a portable console, there's really a lot going on in each mission, and while it's not perfect, it doesn't lag as much as you may think. Plus, the arenas that the battles take place in are quite large and have a lot of obstacles. Unfortunately, and you probably already figured this out from watching, but this game doesn't look that great. It definitely seems like the graphics were compromised to make up for everything else, but at least the Gundam models look okay, and the environments are cool, especially the ones that take place in space. There's also no English voice acting, which I suppose I understand. This game, like many of the others on here, got pretty middle-of-the-road reviews when it came out, and I think this is the only case in this video where I pretty much agree completely with the critics. It's not a bad game, and while it does present some interesting ideas and can be engaging at times, the game overall is nothing special, and considering that a digital copy will still cost you $40, I can only recommend it to the hardest of hardcore Gundam fans. Okay, I think this video has gone on just about long enough, but I have one game left. The only first-party title on here, and probably one of the least-known first-party games from Sony. Orashika Tainted Bloodlines, developed by Alpha System and published by Sony Computer Entertainment in 2015. Orashika Tainted Bloodlines is a sequel to the Japan-only PS1 title, Ore no Shikabane o Koete Yuke, although, thankfully, the two stories are independent from one another. Now, I think it goes without saying, but Orashika is an absolutely beautiful game that is oozing with style from every pore. It features some very well done animated cutscenes with beautiful artwork that combines traditional Japanese art with contemporary anime art, and this style bleeds into the graphics as well. The dungeons are all 3D rendered, but done in a style that looks like something straight out of a Japanese painting, and the battles take place on a stage, just like in Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. And speaking of Paper Mario, the enemies are also rendered in a 2D style very similar to that, and it looks great, and the music is really good too. Now, the story for this game is that you are a member of a disgraced family from Japan's Heian period that is sentenced to death by the Emperor after failing to protect 5 artifacts from demons. One of the gods feels sorry for you and resurrects you and your family under 2 conditions. They only get to live for 2 years, and they can't reproduce with other humans. Now, the introductory cutscene is pretty long, and while this may sound like a story-heavy game, it's actually not very cutscene-heavy. This has more of an effect on the gameplay, and I think that is what makes Orashika really stand out. Like I mentioned, it's a dungeon crawler with turn-based combat. Now, the combat itself is pretty standard. I mean, you run into enemies, choose your action, etc., but it does have rows that affect which enemies you can and can't hit, and some weapons can hit multiple enemies with one swing. While it's not a roguelike, it does contain a lot of roguelike elements. For one thing, the loot you get at the end is determined through a slot machine at the start of battle, and you can actually get some pretty good loot from regular battles. There are also hidden conditions that, if you defeat a battle with them, you can get additional rewards. Also, every enemy team has a leader, and all you need to do to actually win a battle is to kill the leader, which is usually the enemy that you ran into in the overworld. So, while this generally won't get you any special bonuses, it is a good way to speed through battles if you're in a hurry. Just remember that this applies to your party too. If your leader goes down, it's game over. but really, this is only half the gameplay. What really makes this game stand out is the fact that it's half a management simulator. Remember what I said earlier about members of your clan only surviving 2 years? Well, this game has a calendar system that advances after a certain amount of the game has been played, including during dungeons. Yeah, it's not uncommon for months to go by when dungeon crawling, so you have to find the right balance between speed and exploration. There actually is a sprint button, but this depletes your health bar. Either way, no matter how you go about it, chances are you won't be able to complete the game in just 2 years. So what do? You have to continue your family tree, but since you can't mate with other humans, you have to do it with gods and goddesses through a devotion system where you create a successor with traits dependent on the parents. And because of the curse placed on your family, they become adults and ready to join the party very quickly. But that's not all. You can also invest in the different shops in your town to improve their inventory, go on expeditions to other places, participate in competitions against other clans. There is just a lot to manage here, and if that sounds like too much, Kochin, your weasel guide, will create a plan for you. She also provides suggestions in battle. I mean, when you start the game, you have options to adjust it, not based on how hard you want it to be, but based on other factors like how long you want it to be. And that's something I've never seen done before. Did I mention that this game also has a lot of different classes to assign to your party members and a very in-depth character creator that can even scan your face and auto-generate a character using the Vita's camera, although I can't show this to you because I'm recording on the PS TV. If I did have to find one thing to complain about, it's that this game isn't really all that clear on what exactly you need to do. Even in the early parts of the game, you have multiple dungeons to choose from, and not all of them are necessary to explore. I wouldn't feel bad about using a guide your first time playing. Overall though, Orashika is an amazing game, maybe even a masterpiece. It does a lot of unique things, and almost everything it does extremely well. It has an interesting premise, and the gameplay is fast-paced, fun, and rewarding, and it has a ton of different ways to play. It's truly a one-of-a-kind experience, and if there was a game on here that was worth owning a Vita for, this is it, and that goes double for there being a game that needs to be ported to the PS4 or 5. And that is going to be it for this video. I hope y'all enjoyed, and be sure to tell me what you think, and let me know if there are any Vita games that I happen to miss. As usual, be sure to check out my other links in the description, consider leaving a Ko-Fi donation, and until the next video, I will see you all later.
I see